Mobile, Alabama holds a secret that court records tried to bury for over a century. Between 1847 and 1851, 12 people died under circumstances that seemed natural at first. Fever, accidents, sudden illness, except for one impossible detail. An enslaved man named Solomon predicted every single death with chilling accuracy, sometimes weeks before they happened. What authorities discovered in the spring of 1851 wasn't divine prophecy or a supernatural gift. It was something far more terrifying, a mind so calculating, so patient, that it turned observation into murder and made coincidence look like fate. The truth remained sealed in courthouse documents until researchers uncovered testimonies revealing how one man weaponized knowledge in the most disturbing way imaginable. Before we continue with the story of Solomon and the deaths that haunted Mobile's wealthiest families, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Trust me, you'll want to follow what happens next. What makes Solomon's story particularly unsettling isn't just the body count. It's how long he operated in plain sight, turning his position as a trusted servant into the perfect cover for systematic elimination. Mobile in 1847 sat at the mouth of the Alabama River like a jewel of Southern commerce, its docks crowded with cotton bales destined for Liverpool and New York. The city had grown fat on trade, its population swelling past 15,000 souls, nearly half of them enslaved. Three-story townhouses lined Government Street, their wrought iron balconies overlooking brick sidewalks where merchants argued prices and lawyers hurried between courthouses. The smell of the bay mixed with tobacco smoke from warehouses, and in summer, yellow fever turned the air thick with dread and burning tar. The DeVoe family owned one of the finest houses on Conti Street, a Greek Revival mansion with 6 white columns and gardens that stretched back to an alley lined with servants' quarters. Pierre DeVoe had made his fortune in cotton factoring, handling crop sales for planters who trusted his connections to northern buyers. His wife, Marguerite, came from New Orleans money, and she ran the household with the precision of a general commanding troops. They owned 23 enslaved people, field hands at their plantation 10 miles north, and house servants who maintained appearances in town. Solomon arrived at the DeVoe house in the winter of 1843, purchased from an estate sale in Charleston. He was 31 years old, tall and lean, with hands that showed old scars from carpentry work. The bill of sale listed him as literate, skilled in medicine and carpentry, docile temperament. That last word should have been questioned more carefully. Previous owners had allowed Solomon unusual privileges. A Quaker physician in Charleston had taught him to read medical texts, recognizing an unusual aptitude for diagnosis. Solomon could identify fever types by examining tongue color and breathing patterns. He knew which plants induced vomiting, which ones stopped hearts, which created symptoms identical to cholera or consumption. The Quaker had intended this knowledge for healing. Solomon had other plans. In the DeVoe household, Solomon worked as a general servant, maintaining the house, running errands, occasionally assisting with minor medical care when doctors weren't available. Mobile's physicians were expensive and often drunk, so families relied on their more knowledgeable slaves to treat minor ailments. Pierre DeVoe considered himself progressive for allowing Solomon access to his library, never imagining what the men did with those anatomy texts and botanical encyclopedias. Late at night, Solomon shared quarters behind the main house with 7 other enslaved people: Marcus, who drove the carriage, Rachel, who cooked, Eliza and Hannah, who cleaned, and 3 younger men who worked the gardens and performed heavy labor. They knew Solomon read books, that he sometimes went into the city on errands alone, that he had a way of watching people that made even the other slaves uneasy. But in a world where survival meant minding your business, no one asked questions. The white families in Solomon's orbit that year formed Mobile's commercial aristocracy. Besides the DeVoe family, there were the Chamberlains, Thomas, who owned timber mills, and his wife Abigail, who collected porcelain from France. The Appleton family controlled cotton warehouses on Water Street. Robert Appleton was loud and crude, famous for his gambling and his vicious treatment of slaves. His sister Catherine had married young to a man who drank himself to death, leaving her dependent on her brother's charity and cruel humor. These families intersected constantly at St. Francis Street Methodist Church on Sundays, at cotillions during the social season, at business meetings where fortunes rose and fell on cotton prices and shipping schedules. Their slaves moved between households, delivering messages, running errands, attending their owners at social functions. This created a network, a web of observation opportunities that Solomon studied like a scholar examining a map. What no one understood yet was that Solomon had spent his 4 years in Mobil doing something unusual. He was learning. Learning schedules, routines, weaknesses. Learning who drank, who had weak hearts, who feared illness above all else. Learning which families fought behind closed doors, which marriages had gone cold, which men carried secrets that made them vulnerable to pressure. He watched, he listened, and he waited. He also collected. In the gardens and during his errands through Mobil streets, Solomon gathered plants, white snakeroot from shaded areas near the river, pokeweed roots, death camas bulbs, oleander leaves from ornamental gardens. He knew foxglove's effect on an already strained heart, how aconite could mimic a sudden stroke, how small amounts of arsenic could be explained away as contaminated well water. Mobil's wealthy families never locked medicine cabinets against their trusted house servants. The other enslaved people noticed Solomon's herb collecting but assumed he was preparing remedies. Rachel mentioned it once, "You got a powerful lot of plants drying in your room." But Solomon just smiled and said he was studying to help with doctoring. That satisfied her. After all, anything that might reduce doctor bills and keep their owners from blaming slaves for illnesses had to be good. By the spring of 1847, Solomon had everything ready. He had knowledge, access, and most importantly, he had identified his targets with cold precision, not random deaths that would attract attention. Instead, he chose people whose deaths would seem natural, expected, even people whose habits or health made them vulnerable, people whose losses would redistribute power, create vacancies, shift household dynamics in ways that might eventually create opportunities. The temperature ran hot that April, unusually so for early spring. The air felt swollen with moisture, and at night the croaking of frogs from the marshes near the bay grew so loud it kept people awake. Solomon went about his duties with his usual quiet efficiency, but something had changed in how he watched people. His gaze lingered a half-second longer. When he served dinner, he noticed everything: who ate what, who drank from which glass, who complained of headaches or stomach troubles. The first death happened on April 23, 1847, and at the time no one thought it unusual. Thomas Chamberlain collapsed in his study after dinner, clutching his chest and gasping for air. His wife found him face down on the carpet, his lips already turning blue. Dr. Wickham arrived within the hour, but Chamberlain was already dead. The doctor examined the body, noted the man's florid complexion and heavy build, and pronounced it heart failure, common enough in a man of 53 who enjoyed rich food and afternoon cigars. What made the death memorable wasn't the death itself. It was what happened 3 days before. Solomon had been at the Chamberlain house delivering a message from Pierre Devaux about a timber shipment. He'd waited in the servants' entrance, but Thomas Chamberlain had walked past on his way to his study, red-faced and breathing hard after climbing the stairs. Solomon had watched him for a long moment, then said something that the Chamberlain's cook, Mary, would remember later. "That's a dying man," Solomon had said quietly. "His heart won't last the week." Mary had laughed it off. "You don't know that. Mr. Chamberlain's strong as an ox." Solomon had just looked at her with those steady eyes. 3 days, maybe 4. His heart's working too hard. You can see it in how his fingers swell, how his neck pulses. It's going to stop. When Thomas Chamberlain died 3 days later, Mary felt a chill run down her spine. She mentioned it to her mistress, who dismissed it as coincidence. "The man had a weak heart," Abigail Chamberlain said. Everyone could see he wasn't well. But Solomon's prediction stuck in Mary's mind like a splinter. The second death came 6 weeks later in early June. The heat had settled over Mobil like a blanket soaked in warm water. Yellow fever season was approaching, and families who could afford it were already planning to flee to higher ground inland. Catherine Appleton, Robert Appleton's widowed sister, took ill on a Wednesday evening. It started with stomach cramps, then violent vomiting that left her weak and shaking. By Friday, she was delirious with fever. Dr. Wickham suspected cholera, though no other cases had been reported. He prescribed laudanum for the pain and told the family to prepare for the worst. Catherine died on Saturday morning, her body so dehydrated her skin had taken on a grayish cast. The doctor noted acute gastric distress, possibly cholera or food poisoning, on the death certificate. This time, Solomon's prediction had been more specific. 2 weeks before Catherine fell ill, Solomon had been sent to the Appleton house to deliver legal documents. Robert Appleton had been berating Catherine in the hallway, something about her being a burden, eating his food and giving nothing back. Solomon had witnessed the whole scene while waiting by the door, seeing how Catherine's hands trembled, how she fought back tears. Later, when he'd returned to the DeVoe house, he'd mentioned to Eliza that Catherine Appleton wouldn't live through the summer. "She's got a sadness in her that's eating her from inside," he'd said. "And Mr. Appleton don't feed her right. A body that weak catches everything. I'd say 2 weeks, maybe 3, before she takes sick and don't recover." Eliza had noted the comment but thought nothing of it until Catherine died. Then she remembered, and the memory sat uneasily in her stomach. The deaths continued through that summer and into fall, each one seemingly natural, each one predicted by Solomon with unsettling accuracy. In July, a clerk named William Foster, who worked at the Cotton Exchange, drowned in the bay. He'd been drunk, stumbled off the dock at night, and no one found his body until the next morning. Solomon had told Marcus, the carriage driver, a week before that Foster was living on borrowed time, and that a man who drinks that much near water won't last long. In August, an elderly woman named Mrs. Talbert, who lived 3 houses down from the DeVoe family, died in her sleep. Natural causes, the doctor said. She was 76, after all. But Solomon had mentioned to Rachel 2 weeks earlier that Mrs. Talbert's heart is tired. She'll go quiet one night, probably before September. By the time autumn arrived, Solomon had predicted 5 deaths, and all 5 had occurred within days or weeks of his predictions. The enslaved people in the DeVoe household had started to notice the pattern, though none of them spoke about it directly. There was something about Solomon's predictions that felt wrong, but putting that feeling into words seemed dangerous. In October, something changed. The deaths became more frequent, and Solomon's predictions grew bolder. The whispers started in the quarters behind the big houses, spreading through the network of enslaved people who moved between Mobile's wealthy families like blood through veins. "Solomon sees things," one house servant told another while washing clothes at a communal well. "He's got the sight," an older woman said at the market, shaking her head. "My grandmother had it, knew when death was coming." But others weren't so sure. Marcus, who'd known Solomon the longest, started watching him more carefully. He noticed how Solomon volunteered for certain errands, how he always seemed to know when people were going out, when houses would be empty, when doors would be unlocked. He noticed the herbs Solomon collected, the way he ground them with a mortar and pestle late at night when he thought no one was watching. "Men can't see the future," Marcus said quietly to Rachel one evening. "But he can sure make it happen." Rachel had stared at him, the cooking spoon frozen in her hand. "You saying what I think you're saying?" Marcus didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "You ever notice how the people Solomon predicts dying are always people he's been near? People he served food to or brought medicine to or had some reason to be close to?" Rachel remembered the herbs, the powders, the way Solomon sometimes brought tonics to sick people as acts of kindness. The thought that formed in her mind was so terrible she couldn't hold it there long. To even think such a thing was dangerous. If she was wrong, she'd accused an innocent man. If she was right, she knew something that could get her killed. So she did what most enslaved people did when confronted with dangerous knowledge: she stayed quiet and watched. The 6th death came in November, and it struck close to home. Pierre DeVoe's business partner, a man named Henry Laurent, died suddenly at age 48. He'd been healthy, robust even, but took ill with what seemed like influenza. Within 3 days, he was dead. The doctor noted sudden respiratory failure and suggested it might have been a particularly virulent strain of lung fever. Solomon had predicted it 2 weeks earlier, mentioning to Pierre DeVoe himself that Laurent looked poorly and might want to settle his affairs soon. DeVoe had dismissed it as idle chatter, but when Laurent died, he remembered the conversation with a cold prickle of unease. What DeVoe didn't know was that Solomon had visited Laurent's house 4 times in the 2 weeks before his death, each time bringing paperwork from DeVoe's office. Each time, Laurent had offered him coffee or water, which Solomon had politely declined but had helped prepare. Laurent's personal servant, an enslaved man named Jacob, later recalled that Laurent had complained of a strange, bitter taste in his morning coffee on 2 occasions but had blamed it on bad beans. The 7th death was even more disturbing because it involved a child. The Whitfield family lived on Government Street in a house almost as grand as the DeVoe mansion. They had 4 children, and the youngest, a girl named Sarah, age 7, had always been delicate. She caught every illness that passed through Mobile, and her mother worried constantly about her health. In December, Solomon mentioned to Marguerite DeVoe that the Whitfield girl won't see spring. He said it casually while serving tea, as if commenting on the weather. She's got a weakness in her lungs. Next fever that comes through will take her. Marguerite had been horrified by the pronouncement. That's a terrible thing to say about a child. Solomon had bowed his head. Just speaking truth, ma'am. I've seen that look before. The body's giving up. Sarah Whitfield took sick with pneumonia in January 1848 and died after a week of fever and struggling breath. Her mother was inconsolable. The doctor said it was tragic but expected given the child's fragile constitution. But when Marguerite heard about the death, she remembered Solomon's prediction with a feeling like ice water in her veins. How could he have known? And why did it feel less like prophecy and more like a plan being executed? She mentioned it to her husband that night. Pierre, there's something odd about Solomon. He's predicted too many deaths, and they all come true. Pierre had poured himself more brandy and waved her concerns away. The man's observant. He spent time with that Quaker doctor in Charleston. He knows how to read signs of illness. It's not witchcraft, Marguerite. It's education. But even Pierre felt uneasy. He'd started noticing how Solomon moved through the house, silent, watchful, always present but never quite there, like a shadow that had learned to serve dinner. The eighth death drove the whispers from quiet concern to open fear. Robert Appleton, the cotton warehouse owner who'd treated his sister so cruelly, died in February 1848. He'd been drinking at a gambling house on Water Street, got into an argument over cards, and walked home in a rage. Somewhere along the way, he collapsed in an alley. A night watchman found him at dawn, cold and stiff, his face frozen in a grimace. The doctor ruled it a stroke, likely brought on by excessive drink and his notorious temper. But Robert Appleton was only 42, and though he drank, he'd always been strong as a bull. Solomon had predicted this death a month earlier, telling Marcus that Mr. Appleton is going to push his luck too far one of these nights. A man with that much anger in him, drinking like he does, his brain's going to pop like an overripe fruit. Marcus had felt sick when he heard about Appleton's death. The prediction had been too specific, too confident, and he knew something no one else knew. Solomon had been sent to deliver a message to Appleton the night before his death. He'd been alone with Appleton for several minutes in the warehouse office, and when he'd returned to the carriage, Marcus had noticed something odd. Solomon's hands smelled like bitter almonds. That detail haunted Marcus. Bitter almonds. He'd heard stories about poison that smelled like that, something that could stop a man's heart or make his brain seize up. But how did you even get such a thing? And more importantly, how did you accuse someone of having it without proof, without putting your own neck in a noose? By the spring of 1848, Mobile's enslaved community was divided into two camps, those who believed Solomon had supernatural powers, and those who suspected something far more sinister. The believers pointed to his accuracy. 8 people, and he called every single one, said one woman who worked as a seamstress. That's not luck, that's sight. Maybe he made a deal, another whispered, making a sign against evil. Sold his soul for knowledge. But among those who knew Solomon personally, who lived in the same quarters, who worked alongside him, a different theory was forming. They didn't speak it aloud, but it hung in the air like smoke. Solomon wasn't predicting deaths. He was causing them. The problem was evidence. In a legal system that barely recognized enslaved people as human beings, where their testimony in court was worthless unless corroborated by white witnesses, what could they possibly do? Report their suspicions to Pierre Devaux and say what, exactly? That they thought his trusted servant was a murderer based on herbs and hunches. They'd be punished for making trouble, probably sold away, or worse. So they watched and waited, hoping someone with actual power would notice the pattern. That someone turned out to be Dr. Edmund Wickham, the physician who'd pronounced death certificates for 5 of Solomon's predicted victims. Wickham was a competent doctor, though he carried the cynicism common to men who'd seen too much death. He drank more than he should, but he wasn't a complete fool. And by March of 1848, he'd begun to notice something disturbing, a cluster of deaths that all seemed natural, yet all somehow connected to the Devaux household. It started when Abigail Chamberlain, now widowed and managing her late husband's timber business, mentioned during a social call that the Devaux family's servant had predicted her husband's death. She said it lightly, as an oddity, but Wickham's interest sharpened. "What do you mean, predicted?" he'd asked. Told the cook his heart would give out within the week, and it did. 3 days later. Wickham had a mind that collected details like a magpie collecting shiny objects. He remembered other cases where family members had mentioned a servant's predictions, the Whitfield girl, Catherine Appleton. He couldn't remember which servant specifically, but the pattern was there, nagging at him. He began keeping notes, reviewing his old cases, asking questions at social gatherings. By April, he'd identified Solomon as the common thread. Always Solomon, making predictions, always correct, always within striking distance of the deceased in their final days. The question was what to do with this information. Accusing a slave of murder required evidence that would satisfy a court of law, and Wickham had nothing but suspicions and a disturbing pattern. More importantly, making such an accusation would force him to admit he'd missed 8 murders happening right under his nose. His reputation would be destroyed. So Wickham did what many men in his position would do: he tried to catch Solomon in the act. He began attending social functions at houses where Solomon served, watching the men work. He observed how Solomon moved, where his hands went, how he served food and drink. He saw a competent servant who blended into the background, nothing more. But he also noticed something else: Solomon was watching him back. It was subtle, a glance held a second too long, a slight smile when their eyes met across a room. Solomon knew he was being observed, and he didn't seem concerned. In fact, he seemed amused. The 9th death came in May 1848, and it struck at the heart of Mobile's legal establishment. Judge Marcus Finley, who presided over the city circuit court, died at his home after a brief illness. He'd been 61, complained of chest pains for several weeks, and finally succumbed to what Dr. Wickham diagnosed as heart disease, a natural death entirely explicable for a man of his age and habits, except that Solomon had predicted it 5 weeks earlier, mentioning to Pierre Devaux that Judge Finley wouldn't live to see his daughter's wedding in June. Pierre Devaux finally took notice. He called Solomon into his study the day after Finley's funeral and confronted him directly. "How did you know?" Devaux demanded. "How did you know about Judge Finley and the Chamberlain girl and all the others?" Solomon had stood with perfect posture, his face carefully neutral. "I observe, sir. When you learn to read signs of illness, you see patterns others miss." Judge Finley had the look of a man whose heart was failing. Anyone trained in medicine could have seen it. "But you're not a doctor," Devaux said. "You're a slave who learned some medicine from a Quaker. That doesn't give you the power to predict when someone will die down to the week." "No, sir," Solomon agreed. "But it gives me the ability to see death coming when others don't want to look." There was something in how he said it, something that made Devaux's skin prickle. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet confidence that didn't belong in a slave speaking to his master. It felt like a challenge wrapped in obedience. Devaux dismissed him but couldn't shake the conversation. That night, he mentioned it to Dr. Wickham at the Mobile Gentlemen's Club, and for the first time, the two men compared notes systematically. 9 deaths, 9 predictions, 9 perfect hits. "It's impossible," Devaux said, but his voice carried doubt. "Not if he's making them happen," Wickham replied quietly. They stared at each other across the table, the magnitude of the accusation settling between them like something physical. If Solomon was a murderer, he'd been operating freely for over a year, killing Mobile citizens with impunity while everyone assumed his victims were dying of natural causes. "We need proof," Devaux said finally. "Real evidence, not just patterns, because if we accuse him and we're wrong, I'll be ruined. And if we accuse him and we're right, we'll need to explain how we let 9 people die before we noticed." They agreed to watch Solomon more carefully, to document everything, and to wait for him to make a mistake. What they didn't realize was that Solomon had already anticipated their suspicions and was planning his most audacious move yet. The late spring of 1848 brought tension to the Devaux household like storm clouds piling up before lightning. Solomon continued his duties with the same quiet efficiency, but everyone felt the change. Marguerite Devaux found herself watching him serve dinner, wondering if the fork he handed her had touched something it shouldn't have. Pierre began locking his medicine cabinet and checking the contents each night. Dr. Wickham visited more frequently, always observing, always taking notes. The enslaved people in the household felt the pressure worst of all. They knew something was coming. They could see it in the white folks' nervous glances, in how Solomon had grown even quieter than usual, in how the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Rachel finally broke the silence one night in the quarters. "Solomon, they're watching you. Whatever you've been doing, you need to stop." Solomon had been grinding herbs with his mortar and pestle, the soft scraping sound filling the small room. He didn't look up. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," Marcus said from the doorway. His voice was hard, angry. "We all know. Maybe we don't talk about it, but we know. Those people you predicted dying, they didn't just die. You helped them along." Solomon finally looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched so tight it felt like something might snap. "You think you know," Solomon said quietly. "But you don't understand what it's like to watch people who own you act like gods. To see them destroy lives on a whim. To watch them grow fat while others starve. To listen to them preach about mercy in church and then come home and beat people for breaking a dish. So you killed them." Rachel's voice shook. "You just decided who deserved to die." "I decided," Solomon said, and there was something terrible in his calmness, that if I'm going to be property, if I'm going to serve their food and wash their clothes and listen to their secrets, then I might as well be useful in my own way. Every person I've helped along was someone who made the world worse by breathing in it. "That's not your choice to make," Marcus said. But his voice lacked conviction, because the truth was, every enslaved person in that room had fantasized about the deaths of their oppressors. Solomon had just made those fantasies real. "It's not about choice," Solomon replied. "It's about possibility. They gave me knowledge, access, trust. They taught me medicine so I could help them, never thinking I might use it for anything else. That was their mistake. And now?" Eliza asked quietly. "What happens now that they suspect?" Solomon smiled, and it was the most frightening thing any of them had ever seen, not because it was cruel, but because it was genuinely amused. "Now I give them exactly what they expect." The 10th death came 2 weeks later, and it changed everything. Dr. Edmund Wickham himself fell ill on a Tuesday morning in early June. It started with dizziness, then nausea so severe he could barely stand. By Wednesday, he was bedridden with symptoms that resembled severe food poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, weakness. His wife called in another physician from Montgomery, but by Thursday, Wickham's kidneys were failing. He died on Friday afternoon, and with his last rational moments, he managed to tell his colleague something, check Solomon, the devout slave. Poisoner. But the words came out slurred and desperate, the ravings of a dying man in delirium. The Montgomery physician nodded soothingly and noted, acute renal failure, possible arsenic poisoning, on his preliminary findings, but he had no proof of how such poisoning might have occurred. What made Wickham's death particularly damning was the timing. Solomon had predicted it 3 weeks earlier, mentioning casually to Marguerite Devoux that Dr. Wickham looks poorly lately. All that drinking takes a toll. I wouldn't be surprised if his kidneys give out before summer. When Wickham actually died of kidney failure, panic rippled through Mobile's upper class. Pierre Devoux went to the sheriff that very day, bringing his concerns about Solomon and the pattern of deaths. The sheriff, a practical man named James Cartwright, listened with growing unease. "You're saying your slave has murdered 10 people over the past year, and you're only now reporting it?" "I didn't know," Devoux said desperately. "None of us knew. The death seemed natural. It's only when you look at the pattern that you see something's wrong." Cartwright drummed his fingers on his desk. "Pattern isn't evidence. We need proof. Witnesses. Poison found in his possession, something concrete. Otherwise, you're asking me to hang a man based on coincidence." "Dr. Wickham suspected him," Devoux insisted. "He was investigating when he died." "Which makes it convenient, doesn't it?" Cartwright said dryly. "The man investigating gets poisoned. That's either the worst luck in the world or the boldest murderer I've ever heard of." They decided on a search of Solomon's quarters that evening. Cartwright, Devoux, and 2 deputies arrived just after sunset, entering the small room behind the main house where Solomon slept. What they found made their blood run cold. Hidden under the floorboards beneath his bed, jars of dried plants, aconite, white snakeroot, death camas, oleander, powdered substances wrapped in paper packets, a small ledger with dates, names, and cryptic notes written in careful script. The handwriting was educated, precise, nothing like what they expected from a slave. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Mobile intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Because Solomon's ledger contained something even more disturbing than his collection of poisons. The ledger told a story of meticulous planning that spanned not 1 year but nearly 4, starting from the month Solomon arrived in Mobil. The first pages contained observations, nothing more, notes about routines, health conditions, family relationships, weaknesses. TC complains of chest pains, drinks heavily, stares make him breathless. CP malnourished, brother treats her cruelly, prone to stomach ailments. RP drinks, violent temper, walks alone at night. The middle pages showed the planning phase. TC, foxglove extract in evening whiskey, small amounts over 3 weeks, will mimic natural heart failure. CP, white snake root in milk, symptoms identical to cholera. RP, aconite in wine, rapid action resembles stroke or seizure. The final pages were even more chilling. They contained predictions written weeks or months before the actual deaths, with spaces left for the date of death to be filled in later. Every single one had been filled in, the dates matching exactly with when each person had died. But the last entry is what made Sheriff Cartwright's hands shake as he read by lamplight, EW, arsenic compound, gradual administration over 2 weeks. Kidney failure. Will die week of June 10th, final obstacle removed. Below that, 2 more entries remained, PD, pending. MD, pending. Pierre Devoux felt ice water flood his veins as he recognized the initials, his own name, and his wife's. He was planning to kill us, Devoux whispered. Me and Marguerite. We were next. Solomon was arrested that night without resistance. In fact, he seemed to have been waiting for them, sitting on his bed, fully dressed when they burst in with lanterns and weapons. He didn't fight, didn't plead, didn't even seem surprised. Where's the poison you were going to use on Mr. and Mrs. Devoux? Cartwright demanded. Solomon just smiled. Already in the house. You'll never find it. They tore the Devoux house apart over the next 3 days. They searched kitchen stores, medicine cabinets, wine cellars, sugar bowls, tea canisters, everything Solomon might have touched. They found nothing. Either he was bluffing, or he'd hidden it so cleverly that it would only be found when it was too late. Pierre Devoux refused to eat or drink anything from his own house for 2 weeks, living on food prepared at hotels and delivered by people he trusted. Marguerite developed such severe anxiety that she began seeing threats in every cup of tea, every meal, every glass of water. They hired food tasters, posted guards, and still couldn't shake the feeling that death was waiting in their own home, patient and invisible. Solomon's trial began on June 30, 1848, in the same courthouse where Judge Finley had once presided. The proceedings drew crowds that packed the gallery, wealthy families whose friends and relatives had died, curious onlookers fascinated by the sensational case, and enslaved people who watched silently from the segregated section, their faces carefully neutral. The prosecution's case was built on the ledger, the collection of poisons, and testimony from the enslaved people in the Devoux household. Rachel testified about the herbs she'd seen Solomon collecting. Marcus described the bitter almond smell on Solomon's hands the night before Robert Appleton died. Eliza recounted his predictions and how they'd all come true with impossible accuracy. But the most damning testimony came from Jacob, the enslaved man who'd served Henry Laurent. He admitted under oath that Solomon had prepared Laurent's coffee on 2 separate occasions, and that Laurent had complained of a bitter taste both times. He'd said nothing at the time because he'd been afraid, and because who would believe a slave's suspicions? The defense, a young attorney named Philip Hastings appointed by the court, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. Yes, Solomon had plants and substances, but he'd been taught medicine and was known to prepare remedies. Yes, he'd made predictions, but they could be explained by medical observation. The ledger could be interpreted as medical notes rather than murder plans. Where are the witnesses who saw him administer poison? Hastings argued. Where is the direct evidence linking these substances to any of the deaths? We have pattern and suspicion, but we do not have proof beyond reasonable doubt. On the trial's 3rd day, Solomon himself took the stand, a rare occurrence for an enslaved person, but one the prosecution pushed for because they wanted his confession on record. The prosecutor, a stern man named Wallace Breckenridge, approached Solomon with the ledger in hand. Did you write this? Yes, Solomon said calmly. And these entries here, TC, foxglove extract, CP, white snake root, RP, aconite, what do they mean? Solomon looked directly at the jury, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and educated, shocking many in the courtroom who expected broken English and deference. They mean exactly what you think they mean, Solomon said. I studied each person. I learned their weaknesses, and I used that knowledge to remove them from the world. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Hastings tried to object, but Solomon continued. Thomas Chamberlain worked his field slaves to death and laughed when they dropped from exhaustion. Catherine Appleton suffered years of abuse from her brother, and no one helped her. Robert Appleton was a monster who'd beaten 3 slaves to death and faced no consequences. Judge Finley sent men to the gallows for stealing bread while letting wealthy criminals walk free. Dr. Wickham was getting too close to the truth, so he had to go. And the others? Breckinridge demanded. William Foster, Mrs. Talbot, the Whitfield child. Solomon's expression flickered for the first time, something like regret crossing his face. Foster was a witness who saw me near the Appleton warehouse. Mrs. Talbot was kind, but she was too observant. She'd noticed my herb gathering and was asking questions. The Whitfield girl, he paused, and for a moment the courtroom held its breath. That was a miscalculation. I'd intended to target her father, who owed money to Mr. DeVoe and was planning to flee without paying. The dosage was meant for an adult. I regret that error. The courtroom erupted. People shouted, cried out. The judge hammered his gavel for order. In the gallery, Amelia Whitfield had to be restrained by her husband, screaming accusations at Solomon while tears streamed down her face. When order was finally restored, Breckinridge asked the question everyone wanted answered, why? Why did you do this? Solomon's answer was delivered with such calm rationality that it was somehow more disturbing than rage would have been. Because I could, he said simply. You people gave me knowledge and never thought I'd use it against you. You trusted me to handle your food, your medicine, your intimate daily needs, and you never once thought about what that trust made possible. You treated me as property, as something less than human. And then you were surprised when I acted without humanity. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the white faces in the courtroom. I was invisible to you. I moved through your houses like furniture, and you talked about your secrets, your sins, your cruelties, as if I couldn't hear. Every one of you in this courtroom has said or done something in front of a slave that you'd never say in front of your equals. That's power. The power of being underestimated. So this was about revenge? Breckinridge asked. No, Solomon said. Revenge is emotional. This was practical. I selected people whose deaths would either benefit my position, remove threats, or eliminate those whose existence made the world measurably worse. It was systematic, calculated, and it would have continued indefinitely if Dr. Wickham hadn't been as observant as he was. The question of the 2 remaining targets, Pierre and Marguerite DeVoe, hung in the air like poison itself. Did you actually poison the DeVoe family? Breckinridge demanded. Or was that entry in your ledger merely planning? Solomon smiled, and it was a smile that would haunt Pierre DeVoe for the rest of his life. Does it matter? The fear is just as effective as the poison itself, isn't it? You'll spend the rest of your lives wondering. Every meal, every drink, every time you feel the slightest illness, you'll wonder if this is it. If something I put in your house years ago is finally taking effect. That's a kind of death, too, just slower. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Solomon was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out in 2 weeks. The execution took place on July 28, 1848, in the courtyard behind the mobile courthouse. A crowd of nearly 300 people gathered, including most of the families whose relatives had died. The mood was strange, not quite celebratory, but not somber either. It felt like relief mixed with lingering dread, as if executing Solomon might not be enough to erase what he'd done. Solomon walked to the gallows without struggle. He'd refused to see a minister, refused last rites, refused to apologize. When asked if he had any final words, he looked out at the crowd and said something that witnesses would debate for years afterward. You built a system that treats people as property, and you're surprised when property fights back. You'll have others like me. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but they'll come, because you can't own people's minds. No matter how many chains you use, you can only pretend you do until one of us proves otherwise. The trapdoor opened and Solomon dropped. The witnesses said his neck broke clean, a quick death, professionally done. But what haunted them afterward wasn't the execution itself. It was the expression on Solomon's face in those final seconds. No fear, no regret, just a kind of grim satisfaction. The days following the execution were marked by paranoia throughout Mobile's upper class. Despite Solomon's death, Pierre and Marguerite Duval continued their extreme precautions. They never returned to normal eating or drinking habits. Within 2 years, they sold the house on Conti Street and moved to Virginia, unable to shake the feeling that something Solomon had planted was still waiting in their home. The enslaved people in Mobile reacted to Solomon's execution with complicated emotions. Some saw him as a monster who'd killed indiscriminately. Others saw him as something else, not a hero exactly, but a demonstration of power in a system designed to deny them any power at all. They didn't speak about it openly, couldn't, in the world they lived in, but the story of Solomon spread through the enslaved community like wildfire. It was told in whispers, in coded language, always with the understanding that speaking too freely could be dangerous. Sheriff Cartwright ordered autopsies on 4 of Solomon's suspected victims, exhuming bodies to test for poison. The results were inconclusive. Arsenic and other toxins break down over time, and the testing methods of 1848 were crude at best. They found elevated levels of certain compounds in 2 bodies, but not enough to prove definitively that poisoning had occurred. This uncertainty became Solomon's final revenge. Without definitive proof, every natural death in Mobile for the next several years was viewed with suspicion. Did the person actually die of fever? Or had Solomon managed one more murder before being caught? Had he really poisoned the Duval family, or was that just psychological torture? The lack of certainty was in some ways worse than the deaths themselves. The ledger became a source of morbid fascination. Scholars and lawyers studied it, noting the precision of Solomon's handwriting, the intelligence of his planning, the chilling rationality of his notes. It challenged the comfortable narrative that enslaved people were simple, childlike, incapable of complex thought. Here was evidence of a mind that had outmaneuvered Mobile's entire medical and legal establishment for over a year. Dr. Wickham's replacement, a younger physician named Robert Marsh, made a point of studying the case thoroughly. He published a paper in a medical journal about the difficulty of detecting certain plant-based poisons, using Solomon's methods as examples. The paper was controversial. Some doctors accused Marsh of giving poisoners ideas, but it improved understanding of toxicology and prompted better documentation of suspicious deaths. The other enslaved people in the Duval household were interviewed extensively but not charged. Authorities accepted their testimony that they'd suspected something but had been afraid to speak. Rachel, Marcus, Eliza, and the others were sold to different families, scattered across Alabama and beyond. None of them ever spoke publicly about Solomon again. But family histories passed down through generations suggest they carried complex feelings about him for the rest of their lives. The white families who'd lost loved ones found themselves in an uncomfortable position. To acknowledge that their deaths were murders meant admitting they'd been fooled by someone they'd considered inferior. It meant admitting that the system they'd built, one that gave them total power over other human beings, had vulnerabilities they'd never imagined. Some chose to continue believing their relatives had died naturally, finding that easier than accepting the truth. The Duval house on Conti Street stood empty for 3 years before being sold to a family from Mississippi who knew nothing of its history. But even they felt something wrong about the place. The wife reported feelings of unease in the kitchen, and they hired new servants rather than bringing the previous staff back. They stayed only 5 years before moving on. Mobile itself changed in subtle ways after Solomon's case. Families became more cautious about which enslaved people they allowed near food preparation. Some stopped the practice of having literate slaves entirely, fearing that education would lead to similar tragedies. Others went the opposite direction, arguing that better treatment would prevent resentment from building to murderous levels. Neither approach addressed the fundamental injustice that had created Solomon's rage in the first place. The case resurfaced briefly during Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved people began testifying about their experiences. A few elderly witnesses who'd known Solomon spoke about him in interviews, describing a man who'd been brilliant, cold, and frightening. Their accounts emphasized that most enslaved people had opposed his methods, seeing his murders as likely to bring collective punishment on their community. But they also acknowledged understanding his anger, even if they couldn't condone his actions. Modern historians studying the case have noted several disturbing elements. First, Solomon was almost certainly telling the truth about his victims' crimes and cruelty. Court records and personal papers confirm that most of the people he killed had documented histories of violence, corruption, or abuse. Second, his body count of 10 might have been conservative. Several other suspicious deaths occurred in Mobil during the same period, and while Solomon never confessed to more than 10 murders, some researchers believe he may have been responsible for additional killings that were never connected to him. Perhaps most disturbing is the question of the Devoux family. Pierre Devoux died in 1856 of a lingering illness his doctors couldn't diagnose. His symptoms, gradual weakness, organ failure, were consistent with slow-acting poisoning. Marguerite lived longer, dying in 1872, but she suffered from mysterious ailments throughout her life that no physician could successfully treat. Whether Solomon actually did poison them, or whether fear and stress destroyed their health naturally, remains unknown. The courthouse where Solomon was tried still stands in Mobil, now a museum. The ledger is preserved in its archives, displayed behind glass, its pages yellowed but still legible. Visitors who read it describe feeling deeply unsettled, not by gore or violence, but by the clinical precision of the handwriting, the methodical planning, the absolute lack of remorse. It's a reminder that intelligence and education can serve any purpose, that knowledge is not inherently moral, and that systems of oppression create pressures that can explode in terrible ways. The story of Solomon and his 12 predictions, 10 confirmed deaths, 2 that remained forever uncertain, became a cautionary tale told in different ways depending on who was telling it. To some, it was a story about the dangers of educating slaves. To others, it was a story about the inevitable consequences of dehumanizing people. To still others, it was simply a story about an exceptionally intelligent psychopath who happened to be enslaved. But the real horror of Solomon's story isn't the murders themselves. It's how easily he operated, how perfectly he understood the blind spots in the system that enslaved him, and how he used trust and underestimation as weapons. He moved through Mobil's wealthiest homes as invisible death, and no one noticed until he wanted them to. The final word on the case might belong to Solomon himself. When Philip Hastings visited him in his cell the night before the execution, the attorney asked one last question: "Do you regret any of it?" Solomon had thought for a long moment before answering. "I regret the child," he said. That was sloppy. But the others, no. They created me through how they treated people. I was just the consequence they refused to see coming. Whether you view Solomon as a murderer, a victim who became a monster, or something more complicated than either label can capture, his story remains one of the most disturbing episodes in Mobil's history, not because of supernatural horror or inexplicable evil, but because every element of it was terribly, realistically human. This mystery shows us that the most frightening monsters aren't supernatural. They're the ones we create through cruelty and then fail to recognize until it's too late. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been more victims we never knew about? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries that'll keep you up at night, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves dark stories from America's past. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.